I never imagined I'd become responsible for a farm. If you'd asked me 6 months earlier where I'd see myself at 30, I would have said somewhere behind a desk, staring at spreadsheets, pretending I cared about quarterly reports while secretly counting the hours until Friday. Farming wasn't even on the list. I barely knew the difference between hay and straw, and the closest I'd ever been to a cow was a petting zoo when I was a kid. Then my uncle died. He didn't leave me millions. He didn't leave me a mansion or some hidden family fortune. What he left behind was 83 acres of exhausted land, an aging farmhouse, 3 rusting tractors that only one mechanic in the county seemed capable of fixing, and more unpaid bills than I could count. I almost sold it before I even saw it. The only reason I didn't was because there was one sentence buried near the end of his will. The property transfers jointly to Scott Walker and Mark Evans. I was Mark. The problem was, I had absolutely no idea who Scott Walker was. My lawyer assumed I knew. The neighbors assumed I knew. Apparently everyone except me knew who this guy was. It took exactly one phone call to find out. He worked for your uncle, the lawyer explained. Started helping around the farm when he was 19. Stayed ever since. So, an employee? More than that, from what I understand. Family? No. Friend. I believe your uncle considered him one. That didn't answer much. What does Scott think about all this? A pause. He refused to discuss selling. That got my attention. He owns half the farm now, the lawyer continued. You own the other half. I leaned back in my office chair, staring out the window at downtown traffic. So you're telling me I now co-own a failing farm with a complete stranger who doesn't want to sell? That is essentially the situation. Fantastic. 2 days later, I was driving 3 hours into the countryside wondering what terrible decisions had led me here. The GPS eventually lost signal. The paved road became gravel, then dirt. When the farmhouse finally came into view, it looked exactly like the kind of place people took photos of during autumn because it seemed charming from a distance. Close, the white paint had peeled away years ago. One side of the porch sagged enough to make me nervous. The barn roof looked like it had survived several arguments with gravity. Fields stretched endlessly beyond the buildings, but instead of neat rows of crops, they were mostly patches of weeds mixed with neglected soil. The place looked tired, like it had spent years trying to stay alive. I climbed out of my car just as someone slammed the barn door. He noticed me immediately. Tall, broad shoulders, sun-faded baseball cap pulled low over dark hair. Work jeans covered in dirt. His flannel sleeves rolled to his elbows. He couldn't have been much older than me, maybe early 30s, but there was something about him that made him seem older. Maybe it was the weathered expression. Maybe it was the exhaustion. He wiped his hands on a rag before walking toward me. You Mark. Straight to business. Yeah. He nodded once. I'm Scott. No handshake. No smile. Just quiet observation. I suddenly felt ridiculously out of place standing there in clean sneakers and city clothes. You drove a long way. I guess. Another silence. He studied me for a second before speaking again. You here to look around before putting it on the market? There wasn't any accusation in his voice. Just resignation. Like he'd already accepted that answer. I haven't decided. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. You probably should. I was hoping we could talk first. About the farm. He glanced toward the barn. There's plenty to talk about. He led me across the yard without another word. Inside the barn, the air smelled like wood, dust, old machinery, and fresh hay. It wasn't unpleasant. Just different. Honest. Scott walked past shelves stacked with tools that had clearly been organized by someone who actually used them every day. This combine's dead. He pointed toward one machine. Transmission's gone. Then another. That tractor starts if you threaten it enough. I couldn't tell whether he was joking. The third tractor looked like it had retired sometime during the previous century. And that one's basically decoration. I laughed. He didn't. Then, after about 3 seconds, one corner of his mouth lifted. Barely. You smiled. I did. I wasn't sure you could. Don't get used to it. There it was again. Tiny. Almost invisible. but definitely humor. Interesting. We spent the next hour walking the property. Scott knew every inch of it. Every fence post. Every irrigation pipe. Every field. He spoke about the land like someone describing an old friend who'd become sick. This field used to grow corn. He crouched and picked up a handful of soil. Not anymore. Why? It needs work. What kind? Years of it. He let the dirt fall through his fingers. No money. Simple. Matter of fact. No self-pity. Just reality. We eventually reached a small hill overlooking most of the farm. The view was honestly beautiful despite everything. Rolling fields. Lines of old trees. A narrow river in the distance. I could suddenly understand why someone might love this place. You've been here a long time? 12 years. You started when you were 19. That's young. My dad knew your uncle. So that's how you met. Scott nodded. He gave me work when nobody else would. Something in the way he said it made me decide not to ask further. Instead, I looked back toward the farmhouse. So, I hesitated. You really don't want to sell? No. Even though it's losing money? Yes. Why? He looked across the fields before answering. Because farms don't stop being worth saving just because they become difficult. I wasn't sure whether that was aimed at me or himself. Maybe both. Back at the house, he unlocked the front door. The inside looked surprisingly clean. Old, worn, but cared for. This was your uncle's office. He opened one room filled with ledgers, maps, and decades of paperwork. I left everything. You didn't touch any of it? It wasn't mine. That answer stayed with me. Most people would have gone through everything by now. Scott hadn't. You hungry? The question caught me off guard. What? I was making dinner. Oh, I can make enough for two. It sounded less like an invitation and more like basic human decency. I'd appreciate that. He nodded once and disappeared into the kitchen. I wandered through the office while he cooked. Every drawer seemed full of handwritten notes, crop rotations, equipment repairs, loan documents, numbers, so many numbers. One folder caught my attention. Outstanding debts. I opened it, closed it again almost immediately. The amount made my stomach drop. No wonder the farm was failing. When Scott called me into the kitchen 20 minutes later, there were 2 plates waiting on the table. Nothing fancy. Roasted potatoes, vegetables, chicken, comfort food. You cook. I eat. I'll take that as yes. He shrugged. If you live alone long enough, you learn. We ate mostly in silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Just quiet. Eventually, I asked the obvious question. Were you surprised Uncle Henry left you half the farm? Scott stopped chewing. A little. You didn't expect it? No. But you stayed anyway. I promised him I would. Another answer that felt bigger than the words themselves. You made a promise. Yeah. Even after he passed? Scott looked down at his plate. A promise doesn't really stop meaning something. I didn't know what to say to that. Instead, I asked something else. If I decide I want to sell, you can. But I can't stop you. You don't sound convinced. I'm realistic. His voice remained calm. If you want out, I'll figure something out. How? I don't know yet. You'd buy my half? If I had the money. You don't. No. Silence settled again. Then he surprised me. I don't expect you to stay. I looked up. You don't. You've got a life somewhere else. I do. This place wasn't your choice. No. He nodded slowly. I understand. For some reason, that made leaving feel harder. I ended up staying the night. Not because I'd planned to. Mostly because the drive back felt too long after everything I'd seen. And Scott didn't even hesitate when I mentioned it. Guest rooms upstairs. That was all he said. No fuss. No awkward hospitality. He simply handed me a clean towel and pointed toward the staircase before disappearing outside again. I watched him through the kitchen window while I unpacked a small overnight bag from my car. Even after sunset, he was still working. Checking fences. covering equipment before the forecasted rain. Walking through the yard with a flashlight like there were 100 small things that couldn't wait until morning. I realized something. The farm might have been failing, but Scott hadn't stopped fighting for it. Not once. The guest room was simple. Old wooden furniture. A quilt that had clearly been stitched by hand years ago. One window overlooking the eastern fields. No television. No unnecessary decoration. Just quiet. I hadn't experienced this kind of silence in years. Back in the city, there was always traffic, neighbors, distant sirens, elevators, something. Here, nothing. Only insects outside and wind moving through trees. It should have felt lonely. Instead, it felt strangely peaceful. I was halfway through answering work emails when someone knocked softly. Scott, holding 2 mugs. I make tea before bed. He offered me one. I didn't know if you wanted any. I do. Chamomile. You remembered that's what I ordered at dinner. You seemed stressed. He said it so casually that I almost missed it. You noticed. I notice most things. That apparently was true. He leaned against the hallway wall while I took the first sip. So, I said, you always work this late? When there's work. Which is. Always. You'll burn yourself out. He gave a quiet laugh. Probably. You say that like you're okay with it. I'm not. But, if I stop, things get worse. I looked at him for a moment. When was the last time you took a day off? He thought about it. I honestly don't remember. That's not healthy. No. Again, just calm acceptance. Like he'd stopped expecting life to be fair years ago. The next morning I woke before sunrise. Not intentionally. Something outside had made enough noise to pull me out of sleep. I checked my phone. 5:12 a.m. From downstairs came the faint sound of dishes. Scott was already awake. Of course he was. I pulled on yesterday's clothes and headed downstairs. He was making coffee. You don't sleep. I do. When? He glanced at the clock. Usually 4 or 5 hours. That's ridiculous. It gets everything done. No. I poured myself coffee. It gets everything barely surviving. For the first time since I'd arrived, he looked genuinely surprised. Not offended. Just surprised someone had challenged the idea. You sound like Henry. My uncle. He used to tell me the same thing. What happened? Scott stared into his mug. He stopped arguing. There was something sad about the way he said it. Like my uncle had watched him work himself into exhaustion and eventually accepted he couldn't change him. Breakfast lasted all of 10 minutes before Scott stood. I've got fences to repair. Need help. He blinked. You? I have 2 hands. You've probably never fixed a fence. I've never claimed otherwise. He considered me for several seconds. You'll hate it. Probably. You'll get dirty. I assumed. It'll take hours. I smiled. You really don't want me coming. I don't want you thinking farming is easy. I already know it isn't. Another pause. Finally. Fine. By 8 o'clock, I regretted every confident word I'd spoken. Fence posts were heavier than they looked. The sun felt hotter than city sunlight somehow. The ground refused to cooperate. Scott, meanwhile, moved with practiced efficiency. Every motion economical. Every tool exactly where he expected it. He worked like someone who'd repeated these same tasks thousands of times. I mostly got in the way. Hold this. I held it wrong. No. He repositioned my hands. Like this. Sorry. You don't need to apologize. I nearly dropped it. It happens. He never sounded irritated. Just patient. Unexpectedly patient. Around mid-morning, I finally asked what had been bothering me. Why did you stay? Scott kept hammering a post. What do you mean? You were 19. Yeah. You could have left. I could have. But you didn't. No. Why? He drove the final nail into place before answering. I needed somewhere to belong. The words hung between us. You found that here. I think so. There was something painfully honest about him. He never tried making his answers dramatic. He simply stated them. By noon, we were both covered in dirt. Well, Scott looked normal. I looked like someone who'd lost an argument with the entire field. He noticed. You've got mud. Where? He gestured vaguely toward my face. I wiped my cheek. The other side. I tried again. Still wrong. Scott sighed almost silently before stepping closer. Hold still. He brushed the dirt away with his thumb. The contact lasted barely a second. Then he stepped back immediately. Better. For some reason, neither of us spoke for several moments afterward. Finally, I cleared my throat. So, you've probably done that before. Clean mud off someone? Yeah. No. Oh, you were struggling. I noticed. One corner of his mouth lifted again. I could tell. We ate lunch sitting on overturned buckets beside the barn. Sandwiches. Cold lemonade. Neither of us had enough energy for conversation at first. Eventually I asked, "Do you have friends around here?" "A few." "You see them often?" "No." "Why not?" He shrugged. "Work. That's your answer for everything." "It usually is." "What about dating?" That made him look away. "Not much. Too busy." "Something like that." "You've been here 12 years." "Yeah. And nothing." I frowned. "Nothing?" I never really made time. I wasn't sure I believed that was the whole story. There was something else there. Something he deliberately left unsaid. I decided not to push. Not yet. Later that afternoon, clouds rolled in much faster than expected. Scott looked toward the sky once. "We need to hurry. Storm. Big one." Within minutes the wind picked up. By the time we'd reached the equipment shed, rain started falling. Then pouring. We barely made it inside before the sky completely opened. Rain hammered against the metal roof so loudly conversation became impossible. We stood there catching our breath. The space was small. Closer than either of us expected. Scott laughed quietly. "What?" "I forgot to check the forecast." "The man who notices everything forgot?" "Apparently. I'll try not to tell anyone." "I appreciate that." Lightning flashed outside. For a moment the entire shed lit up. Then darkness again. "You afraid of storms?" he asked. "No." "You looked nervous." "I was calculating how expensive it would have been if we'd left that equipment outside." He actually laughed this time. A real laugh. Warm. Short. Unexpected. "You've been here one day. So? You're already worrying about farm equipment." I looked out at the rain. "I guess I am." Neither of us noticed how long we'd been standing there until the rain finally softened nearly 40 minutes later. Scott opened the shed door. The farm looked completely different. Everything smelled fresh, clean, alive. He smiled. Not the tiny, almost smiles from before. A real one. Transformed his entire face. "You like rain." "I do. It shows." He looked across the soaked fields. They needed this. I found myself watching him instead of the landscape. And for reasons I couldn't explain, the idea of selling the farm suddenly didn't seem quite as simple as it had 48 hours earlier. The rain left behind a different farm. Everything looked brighter the next morning. The fields weren't suddenly healthy, and the buildings certainly hadn't repaired themselves overnight, but the dust was gone. The grass looked greener. Even the old barn somehow seemed less tired. I stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching mist drift across the lower fields. "It's always like this after rain." Scott's voice came from behind me. "It almost convinces you everything's going to be okay." I looked over my shoulder. "And then," he stepped onto the porch beside me. "Then you remember the bills." I laughed. "You really know how to ruin a peaceful morning." "I've had practice." For a while neither of us spoke. The sunrise painted everything in warm gold, and somewhere beyond the trees I heard birds louder than the traffic I'd grown used to back home. It was nice, dangerously nice. After breakfast I asked the question that had been sitting in my head since arriving. "Can I see the financial records?" Scott looked up immediately. "You actually want to?" "If I'm half owner, I probably should." "They're not pleasant reading." I figured. He disappeared into my uncle's office before returning with 3 thick binders. He placed them on the kitchen table. There. I opened the first one. Within 15 minutes, I understood exactly why Scott had warned me. Equipment loans, property taxes, veterinary expenses from years ago, feed costs, repairs, interest, more interest. By the time I reached the final pages, I leaned back in my chair. This is bad. I was going to say overwhelming. Scott nodded. It gets worse. There's worse. He handed me another folder. Applications for emergency agricultural grants. Every single one rejected. I slowly closed the folder. Henry never told me. He didn't want to worry you. I looked at Scott. And you carried all of this with him? For years. Without saying anything? It wasn't my place. The answer frustrated me. It absolutely was your place. He shook his head. I worked here. You practically lived here. Still, I couldn't understand that way of thinking. If someone had trusted me for 12 years, I would have considered myself family long before then. Scott apparently never had. Around noon, a pickup truck rolled into the yard. An older man climbed out. Weathered face, gray beard, overalls. He waved the moment he spotted Scott. Morning. Morning, Bill. Scott introduced us. This is Bill Carter. Neighbor. Bill snorted. Closest thing this place has to emergency services. Scott actually smiled. That's not inaccurate. Bill looked me up and down. So you're Henry's nephew. I am. Haven't scared you off yet? Working on it. Bill laughed loudly. I like him. Scott rolled his eyes almost imperceptibly. Bill noticed. Oh, he rolled his eyes. I did not. You absolutely did. I stared between them. You joke. Scott frowned. Sometimes. Bill burst into laughter. He's been in a better mood since you showed up. Scott looked genuinely uncomfortable. I've been exactly the same. No. Bill shook his head confidently. You've smiled 3 times already. I smile. Once a month doesn't count. Scott muttered something under his breath that I couldn't quite hear. Bill grinned at me. See, I think I just witnessed his 4th smile. Scott sighed. I'm going back to work. Bill stayed behind while Scott disappeared toward the barn. He always like that? Bill watched Scott walk away. Quiet. Yeah. Mostly. What changed? Bill looked at me carefully before answering. He stopped expecting people to stay. That wasn't the answer I'd expected. What do you mean? Your uncle was about the only constant he had. Bill rested his arms on the porch railing. Folks leave. I guess. Scott got used to it. Something about that sentence lingered. When Henry got sick, Bill continued, Scott practically ran this whole place. He never mentioned that. He wouldn't. Why? He doesn't like talking about himself. I had noticed that. Every answer Scott gave was as short as possible. Like he believed taking up too much space in conversation might somehow inconvenience people. That afternoon we cleaned one of the storage buildings. Mostly because it desperately needed it. You can throw this away. Scott pointed toward a pile of rusted metal. This too. Another pile. What about this? He looked over. No. Really? It's fixable. I raised an eyebrow. It broke in 1998. Still fixable. You never throw anything away, do you? He considered it. Not if it might still have a use. I looked around the building. Suddenly I wasn't sure we were talking about tools anymore. Several hours later we found an old wooden box tucked beneath a workbench. Scott frowned. I've never seen that. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Old family pictures. Farm festivals. Harvests. My uncle. Much younger. Laughing. Then I found one with Scott. He couldn't have been older than 19. Standing beside my uncle. Both covered in mud. Both smiling. It was the biggest smile I'd seen on Scott's face. You kept this? I asked. Scott looked at the photo for a long moment. I forgot it was here. My uncle had one arm around his shoulders. The picture looked natural, comfortable, family. You were happy. Scott nodded quietly. I was. What happened? He gently returned the photograph to the box. Life. There it was again. A complete answer that somehow explained almost nothing. We carried the box back into the house. That evening I sat in the office going through more paperwork while Scott cooked. Eventually I called out, "Scott." "Yeah. Come here a second." He appeared in the doorway holding a dish towel. "What?" I turned one ledger toward him. "These numbers don't make sense." He stepped beside me, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. He studied the page, then reached across me for a calculator. His arm brushed mine accidentally. Neither of us reacted. At least, not visibly. "You added this twice." He pointed. "Oh, there." He erased one line. "That changes everything. It usually helps when numbers are correct." I looked at him. Was that a joke? Maybe. "I'm keeping count now. Please don't." "Too late." He gave me one of those tiny, reluctant smiles again. "I'm up to 5. I regret saying anything." "No, you don't." "No." Dinner felt different that night. More relaxed. Conversation came easier. I learned Scott had never been on an airplane. He learned I'd once burned instant noodles. I didn't know that was possible. "I have a gift." "For disaster?" "Apparently." He laughed again. "A real one. Longer this time. You don't have to look so surprised every time I laugh." "I kind of do." "Why?" "Because you look completely different." Scott stopped eating. "What do you mean?" "You seem—" I searched for the right word. "Lighter." He looked down at his plate. I haven't had much reason to laugh lately. The honesty in that sentence hit harder than he probably intended. That evening my phone rang. My manager. "Mark, are you coming back Monday?" I looked through the kitchen window. Scott was outside feeding the chickens. I hesitated. "I'm not sure yet." There was silence. "You've never sounded unsure before." "I know. We need an answer." "I'll call tomorrow." After hanging up, I stood there longer than necessary. I already knew what staying meant. Unpaid leave. Risk. Possibly losing the promotion I'd spent 2 years working toward. It was irrational. The sensible decision was obvious. Sell my share. Return to the city. Move on. Instead, I walked outside. Scott looked up from the feed buckets. "Everything okay?" "My manager. He wants you back." "Yeah. You should go." I studied him. "You really mean that?" He nodded. "You've got your own life." "And what about this place?" "I'll manage." "You've been managing alone for years." "Exactly." I crossed my arms. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you've convinced yourself asking for help is the same thing as failing." Scott didn't answer. Because he couldn't. His silence told me I'd been closer to the truth than either of us expected. For the first time since arriving, I realized the farm wasn't the only thing that had been carrying too much weight alone. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised both of us. "I'm staying another week." Scott looked up from repairing a gate hinge. "You don't have to." "I know. You'll miss work." "I already called." "And I took vacation." He stared at me for a second. "You used vacation days." "For my own farm." Something softened in his expression. Not relief exactly. More like disbelief. "I didn't think you'd stay this long." I didn't either. As it turned out, 1 week wasn't enough to understand a farm. Every day uncovered 3 new problems. The irrigation system leaked. Half the fencing needed replacing. The grain storage roof had begun sagging. One afternoon I found Scott sitting on the porch steps with a notebook full of expenses. He didn't notice me immediately. He was crossing things out, rewriting numbers, crossing them out again, trying to make impossible math somehow become possible. "Budget." He looked up. "Trying." I sat beside him. "How bad?" He handed me the notebook. I stared at it for several minutes. "You've stopped paying yourself." "I can wait." "For how long?" "As long as necessary." "No." He looked at me. "No. You've been working 12 years. So, you deserve to actually get paid." The farm comes first. I closed the notebook. That's exactly the problem. That evening I opened my laptop. Scott glanced over from the kitchen. What are you doing? Research. On ways this farm could actually make money. He looked skeptical. If there were easy answers. I'm not looking for easy. I spent hours reading. Direct-to-consumer produce. Farm stays. Weekend workshops. Specialty crops. Government programs my uncle had apparently never applied for. By midnight I had pages of notes. Scott walked over carrying 2 mugs of coffee. You've been staring at that screen for 4 hours. I think I found something. He leaned over my shoulder. Farm tours. People pay for experiences now. They'd pay to visit this place? They pay to visit places much less interesting. He looked around the old kitchen. I don't know. You don't have to. I don't. I'll do the worrying. For the first time since I'd arrived, he looked at me the way someone looks at a teammate instead of a guest. The following Saturday, Bill returned. This time he brought 3 other neighbors. Apparently, without telling either of us, he'd mentioned that the old machine shed roof needed replacing. We figured you'd never ask. Within an hour, 6 people were working. One neighbor brought lumber. Another brought tools. Someone else showed up with homemade sandwiches. I stood in the yard watching all of it happen. Scott walked over. They've done this before. They have. When someone's in trouble. You never mentioned that. I didn't think they'd come. You were wrong. He nodded quietly. I was. Bill climbed onto the roof. You two gonna stand there talking all day? Scott looked at me. We should help. We definitely should. Working alongside the neighbors changed something. People greeted Scott warmly, asked how he was sleeping, teased him whenever he became too serious. You smile more now. One woman laughed. I've smiled exactly the same amount. You smiled yesterday. I always smile. Bill nearly dropped a hammer laughing. Listen to him. Scott looked toward me. This is your fault. I've done nothing. You pointed it out. And now everyone notices. He shook his head. I should have stayed quiet. I couldn't help laughing. You wouldn't have. No. You like making people laugh. He looked genuinely confused. I do. You absolutely do. For a moment he seemed to consider that possibility, as though nobody had ever suggested it before. That night the farmhouse felt livelier than it had all week. Mostly because half the neighborhood had stayed for dinner. The kitchen overflowed with food, stories, laughter. At one point Bill raised his glass. To Henry. Everyone echoed the toast. Then Bill looked toward Scott. And to the 2 stubborn fools trying to save his farm. Every pair of eyes landed on us. I wasn't prepared for that. Neither was Scott. He shifted uncomfortably. We're just trying. Bill smiled. That's all Henry ever asked. Silence settled over the room for a moment. Then conversation slowly resumed. Later, while washing dishes, I asked quietly, did my uncle know he was sick for long? Scott kept drying plates. About a year. And you stayed through all of it. Of course. You were here every day. Almost. You never left. He placed another plate into the cupboard. He would have done the same for me. There it was again. That quiet certainty. That loyalty without conditions. I wasn't sure I'd ever met anyone quite like him. A few days later, I finally convinced Scott to leave the farm for an afternoon. I'm taking you to town. No, that's not a suggestion. I've got work. It'll still be here. It always is. Exactly. He sighed. I don't need anything. I know. Then why are we going? Because you've forgotten what a break feels like. 30 minutes later, we were walking through the small downtown area. Scott looked oddly uncomfortable. You don't come here much. No. Why? He shrugged. No reason. I suspected there was one. We stopped at a small cafe. The woman behind the counter smiled the moment Scott walked in. Haven't seen you in ages. I've been busy. So, every year? He gave a faint smile. Something like that. She noticed me. And who's this? Before I could answer, Scott said calmly, "This is Mark." There was a tiny pause. Then he added, "My business partner." I looked at him. Business partner. It wasn't inaccurate. But somehow, hearing him choose those words mattered more than I expected. On the drive back, I finally asked, "You've never called me that before." "What?" "My business partner." He kept his eyes on the road. It seemed appropriate. It did. Another silence. Then he spoke quietly. "I'm glad you didn't sell." I turned toward him. "I haven't decided yet." "I know. But I'm glad you haven't." It was the closest thing to admitting he'd wanted me there. And somehow, that meant more than a dramatic speech ever could. That evening we sat on the porch watching fireflies appear over the fields. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Eventually I said, "My vacation ends Monday." Scott nodded. "You'll head home." "I probably should." "You don't sound convinced." "I'm not." The wind carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across the yard. "I've been thinking." I looked at him. "If we actually tried." He waited. "Really tried? You mean save it?" "Yeah." Scott didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost careful. "I stopped letting myself imagine that." "Why?" "Because hoping hurts when it doesn't work." I looked across the fields glowing beneath the setting sun. "Maybe." Then I looked back at him. "But I think this place deserves one honest chance." For the first time since we'd met, Scott didn't look tired. He looked hopeful. Only for a second. But it was enough for me to realize something I hadn't expected when I first drove down that dirt road. I hadn't just started caring about the farm. I had started caring about the man who'd spent 12 years refusing to give up on it alone. I went back to the city on Monday. Only because I had to. Scott insisted on helping load my car even though there wasn't much to pack. One overnight bag. A laptop. Several folders full of farm records I'd borrowed. He stood beside the driver's door while I checked my mirrors. "So," I said. "So, you'll call if something happens?" "I wasn't planning not to." "Good." He nodded once. "Drive safely." I waited. Felt like he wanted to say something else. Instead, he stepped back. "See you." I started the engine. Halfway down the driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror. Scott was still standing there, hands in his jacket pockets, watching until my car disappeared behind the trees. The city felt wrong. That surprised me more than anything. The apartment I'd been happy to leave a week earlier suddenly felt too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. I unpacked automatically before collapsing onto the couch. My phone buzzed. "Scott, made it home?" I smiled before answering. "Just did." His reply came almost immediately. "Good." That was it. One word. Somehow it still made the apartment feel less empty. Returning to work was even stranger. "So?" My coworker Lisa leaned against my desk. "How's farm life?" I laughed. "Complicated." "You selling?" "I don't know." She frowned. "You've said that 3 times already." "I know. You usually make decisions in 5 minutes. This one's different." "Because?" I opened my laptop but didn't answer. Because every logical reason pointed toward selling. Every emotional reason pointed somewhere else. And I still hadn't figured out which mattered more. For the next 2 weeks, my routine became oddly predictable. Office during the day. Farm paperwork at night. Scott and I texted almost every evening. Nothing dramatic. Nothing particularly personal. Fence finished. That's good. Rain tomorrow. Saw that forecast. Applied for the grant you found. Really? Figured it couldn't hurt. Little conversations. But they happened every day. Without either of us mentioning it. One Thursday afternoon my phone rang. Scott. He almost never called. "Everything okay?" There was a pause. The irrigation pump stopped. "How bad?" "I don't know yet." "You sound exhausted." "I'll figure it out." "Scott." "What?" "When did you sleep?" Another pause. "Yesterday." I rubbed my forehead. "That's not an answer." "I've been busy." "I'll come this weekend." "You don't have to." "I'm not asking." Silence. Then, "Okay." It was the first time he'd accepted help without arguing. I arrived Friday evening just before sunset. Scott was underneath one of the tractors when I pulled into the yard. Only his boots were visible. I climbed out of the car. "You planning to live under there?" His voice echoed from beneath the tractor. "Thinking about it. You'd have better rent." "I've considered that too." A moment later he rolled himself out. His face was streaked with grease. His hair was a mess. He looked exhausted. Really exhausted. "You look terrible." "Thanks. I mean it." "I know." I walked closer. "When's the last time you ate?" He thought about it. "Lunch." "What time?" Another pause. "I don't remember." I sighed. "Kitchen." "What? Now?" "I still have to." "No." I pointed toward the house. "You eat." He looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he quietly nodded. While Scott showered, I made dinner. Nothing impressive. Pasta, vegetables, chicken. He appeared 20 minutes later wearing a clean flannel shirt. His hair was still damp. "You cooked." "You've done it enough times for me." "You didn't have to." "I know." He sat down. For the first few minutes he barely spoke. Just ate. Finally I asked, "Feeling better?" "A little." "You were running on coffee again." "Maybe." "Scott." "I know. You can't keep doing this." He looked down at his plate. "I forget sometimes." "No." He met my eyes. "You think I do it on purpose?" "I think you stop believing you deserve the same care you give everyone else." He didn't respond, because he couldn't. The silence answered for him. The next morning we tackled the irrigation pump together. Mostly by reading manuals neither of us fully understood. Scott laughed after I suggested one particularly terrible idea. "That would have flooded half the field." It was a creative solution. It was. "So you admit I contributed." "You contributed entertainment." "I'll take it." By early afternoon the pump finally roared back to life. Water began flowing through the system again. Scott watched it for several seconds, then quietly said, "We actually fixed it." "We did." I was already calculating replacement costs. "Good thing you didn't need to." He looked at me. "I'm glad you came." Simple words, but they stayed with me. That evening Bill stopped by again. He found us sitting on the porch drinking lemonade. "Look at this." He grinned. "Scott's actually sitting down." "I sit." "No." Bill shook his head. "You pause briefly before finding more work." Scott sighed. "I've been accused." Bill looked at me. "You know what the difference is?" "What?" "He never used to stop." Scott looked away. Bill continued more quietly. "Henry worried about that." The three of us sat silently for a moment. Finally Bill stood. "Anyway," he smiled. "Whatever you're doing." He nodded toward me. "Keep doing it." After he drove away, neither Scott nor I spoke immediately. Eventually he said, "I didn't realize people noticed." "They noticed. I thought I hid it better." "You hid it from yourself." He looked out across the fields. "I think." He hesitated. I forgot what normal looked like. I understood exactly what he meant. When something becomes your everyday life, even exhaustion starts feeling ordinary. Sunday evening came too quickly. I had work again Monday morning. Scott walked me to my car just like before. Except this time, neither of us seemed eager for me to leave. "You know." I leaned against the driver's door. "I could work remotely sometimes." He frowned. "Your company allows that?" "A few days each month." "You'd spend them here?" I was thinking about it. He looked genuinely surprised. "You'd drive 3 hours?" "It's my farm too." For a second he just stared at me. Then he smiled. A real one. "I'd like that." I smiled back. "So would I." As I pulled away that night, I caught him in the mirror again. Still standing in the driveway. Still watching. Only this time, he was smiling. And somehow, knowing he'd be there the next time I came back made the road to the city feel a little shorter. By the end of the month, I had developed 2 different lives. Monday through Thursday, I wore button-down shirts, sat through meetings, and discussed quarterly projections with people who thought an urgent problem meant a delayed presentation. Friday afternoon, I drove 3 hours to the farm. By Saturday morning, I was wearing work boots. It was strange how quickly both lives started feeling normal. Scott had stopped acting like I was a visitor. I noticed it in little ways. He no longer asked if I wanted to help. Instead, he'd simply say, "We're fixing the north fence today," or "We need to check the greenhouse." Not if. We. It was such a small word. But I noticed every time. One Saturday morning, I found him studying a map spread across the kitchen table. "What are you looking at?" "The western field." I leaned beside him. "It hasn't been planted in years. The soil finally tested better." I looked at the report. "You already had it analyzed?" "I mailed samples after you mentioned those specialty crops." I smiled. "You've been doing homework." "I figured if we're trying." He hesitated. "We should actually try." I couldn't help smiling. There he is. What? The hopeful version of Scott. He immediately looked embarrassed. "I'm just being practical." "Sure you are." "I am." "You've started making plans again." He looked down at the map. "Maybe." It was the first time I'd seen him planning further than a week ahead. That alone felt like progress. The grant application I'd helped him submit finally received a response. We opened the email together. Scott stood behind my chair while I clicked. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then, "We got it." Scott blinked. "What?" "We got approved." He leaned closer. "Are you sure?" I turned the screen toward him. "There." He read it twice, then a third time. "They actually." His voice disappeared. I stood. "We did it." Scott laughed. Not quietly, not cautiously. He actually laughed out loud. Before either of us thought about it, he pulled me into a quick hug. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. The moment he realized what he'd done, he immediately stepped back. "Sorry." "For what?" You were excited." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't usually." "I know." For some reason, we both looked away at exactly the same time. The grant wasn't enough to solve everything. But it was enough to repair the greenhouse. Enough to buy irrigation parts. Enough to breathe. For the first time in years, according to Scott, they weren't wondering how to survive the next month. They were thinking about the next season. One evening we sat on the porch making lists. "What else?" I asked. Scott looked down at his notebook. "The website. We'll build one. The signs by the road. I'll design them. The old guest cabin." I looked toward the trees. "I forgot about that. It needs a lot of work." "So do we." He smiled. "Fair." I noticed he'd started smiling without realizing it. A week later, my boss called me into his office. "We're offering you the promotion." I had expected that conversation. What I hadn't expected was how complicated it suddenly felt. It would require full-time office attendance. I nodded. "And relocation closer to headquarters." "I understand. It comes with a significant raise." Normally, I would have accepted immediately. Instead, "I need a little time." My boss looked surprised. "Since when?" "I'm dealing with family property. Take a few days." I thanked him and left. For the rest of the afternoon, I barely heard a word anyone said. That evening, I drove to the farm without waiting for Friday. Scott was repairing a wheelbarrow when I arrived. "You weren't supposed to be here until tomorrow." "I know." He noticed my expression almost instantly. "What happened?" "My promotion." "You got it." "It seems that way." He wiped his hands clean. "You don't sound happy." "I thought I would be." We sat on the porch. The same place where we'd had dozens of conversations already. "I'd have to move." Scott stayed quiet. "It would mean." I looked toward the fields. "I couldn't keep coming." He nodded slowly. "I figured. I've worked toward this for years." "I know. I should want it." "You probably do." "I don't know anymore." Scott folded his hands together. "You don't have to explain." "I want to." He looked at me. "This farm changed something." His eyes stayed on mine. "I think it did." For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, Scott said quietly, "I've been thinking too. About my half. What about it? If taking the promotion is what you want." I frowned. "I'll figure this place out." "Scott, I mean it. You don't have to say that. I'm saying it because it's true." I shook my head. "You'd tell me to go even if it broke your heart." He froze. The silence that followed answered far more than words could have. After several long seconds, he quietly admitted, "I don't want you to leave." It was barely above a whisper. The first truly personal thing he'd said since I'd met him. I felt my heartbeat quicken. "You don't." He looked down at the porch floor. "No. Because of the farm?" Another long silence. Then, "Not only because of the farm." The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh earth between us. Neither of us moved. Neither of us looked away. Something had changed. Neither of us knew exactly what to call it yet. But for the first time, it was no longer just the future of the farm hanging between us. It was ours too. Neither of us mentioned that conversation the next morning. Scott was already outside before sunrise, checking the greenhouse irrigation. I joined him with 2 mugs of coffee. "Thought you could use this." He accepted one. "Thanks." We stood in comfortable silence while the sprinklers slowly came to life. Finally, without looking at me, he said, "I hope I didn't make things awkward." "You didn't. I wasn't planning to say that." "I know. I just—" He stopped. The words came out. I smiled. "I'm glad they did." He looked over at me for a brief second before turning back toward the greenhouse. "So am I." For the next few days, nothing dramatic happened. No confessions. No impossible conversations. If anything, we became even more careful with each other. Not distant, just aware. Every shared smile lasted a little longer. Every accidental glance carried a little more meaning. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply new. The farm, meanwhile, refused to slow down. The greenhouse repairs were finally complete. The new irrigation system worked better than either of us expected. We planted the first specialty vegetables together on a cool Tuesday morning. Scott knelt beside the first row. "You should do the first one." "Why me?" "You came up with the idea." I took one of the small seedlings and carefully lowered it into the soil. Scott covered the roots. "There." He smiled. "Let's hope we're smarter than we look." "I don't think that's a high standard." "It really isn't." I laughed. "You've definitely been making more jokes." "I have. Almost every day." He thought about it. "I guess I have." That afternoon we received our first online booking. A family wanted to visit the farm the following month. Scott stared at the email for nearly a minute. "They're actually coming." "Looks that way." "They're paying." I noticed. He looked genuinely confused. "People want to spend a weekend here?" I looked around the property. The repaired greenhouse. Freshly painted fences. Flowers growing near the porch. They're not just coming for the farm. What else would they come for? "The feeling." He frowned. "What feeling?" I smiled. "The one you stopped noticing because you've lived here too long." Later that evening we cleaned the guest cabin together. Dust covered nearly every surface. Half the furniture needed repair. Scott opened an old wardrobe. "I forgot this was here." Inside were quilts, blankets, and boxes filled with old decorations. I found another photo tucked into one of the boxes. This one was newer. My uncle, Scott, Bill, standing beside a harvest display at the county fair. Scott looked younger, healthier, happier. "You really loved this place," I said quietly. Scott looked at the picture. "I still do. Even after everything?" He nodded. "I just forgot it could love me back." I looked at him. "What changed?" His eyes met mine. "I stopped being alone." Neither of us spoke after that. There wasn't anything to add. The following weekend Bill arrived carrying an old wooden sign. I figured the place needed something better. Scott helped him unload it. Freshly carved into the wood were the words, "Walker and Evans Farm." I stopped walking. "You made this?" Bill grinned. "Took me 3 evenings." Scott ran his fingers lightly across the carved letters. He didn't say anything for several moments. Finally, he looked at Bill. "Thank you." Bill smiled. "You boys earned it." After Bill left, Scott and I carried the sign toward the front entrance. Before setting it into place, he looked at me. "You okay with this? My name's already on half the paperwork. This feels different." "It does." He nodded. "It feels permanent." I looked toward the driveway where everyone would see it. "I think that's the point." Together we secured the sign beside the entrance road. When we stepped back, neither of us spoke. The farm suddenly looked less like something that was ending, more like something beginning. That night we sat on the porch much later than usual. Neither of us seemed eager to go inside. The stars were brighter than I'd ever seen in the city. "I talked to my boss," I finally said. Scott looked over. "And I turned down the promotion." He was completely still. "You did." "I did. You shouldn't make decisions because of me." "I didn't." "You didn't." "I made it because I realized something." He waited. "I kept thinking the city was where my future had to be. And," I smiled softly, "then I noticed every plan I was excited about happened to be here." Scott looked down at his hands. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." After a long silence, he quietly admitted, "I was scared you'd leave." "I know. I told myself I'd be fine." "Would you have been?" He thought for a long time. "No." It was the most vulnerable answer he'd ever given me. A cool breeze drifted across the porch. Scott rested his elbows on his knees. "I've spent 12 years believing that if I worked hard enough, eventually I'd stop feeling alone." He gave a small, almost embarrassed laugh. "Turns out that isn't how it works." "No, it isn't." He looked at the fields stretching into the darkness. "Then you showed up. I almost sold the place." "I know. I nearly left after the first day." "I know that too. And somehow," I looked toward the farmhouse, "this place started feeling like home." Scott smiled. "It started feeling like home again for me too." Our eyes met. No hesitation this time. No uncertainty. Just quiet understanding. Slowly, I reached out and rested my hand over his. Not pulling. Not asking. Just there. Scott looked down at our hands for a moment. Then back at me. His fingers gently closed around mine. No words. None were needed. The night remained peaceful around us. The farm was still carrying debt. There was still more work than either of us could count. Nothing had magically become easy. But for the first time since inheriting half of a struggling farm, neither of us was carrying the weight alone. And somehow that made the future seem a little less impossible. The first guests arrived 6 weeks later. Scott had been nervous since sunrise. He checked the guest cabin 4 separate times, replaced flowers on the porch twice, straightened a welcome sign that was already perfectly straight. "You know they're not coming to inspect us." "I know. You've cleaned that porch 3 times." "I know. They're going to think we're strange." "They probably will." He finally looked at me. "You think I'm overdoing it?" "I think you're trying to make sure people love this place as much as you do." He didn't answer, because that was exactly what he was doing. The family arrived just after noon. Parents, 2 young daughters. The girls immediately spotted the chickens. Within seconds, they were laughing as one particularly determined hen followed them around the yard. Scott froze. "What do I do?" I blinked. "What?" "I've never had guests." "You talk to them." "What if I say something stupid?" "You won't." "I might." "You definitely won't." He looked unconvinced. Then the younger girl ran toward him. "Mister, can I help feed them?" Scott looked completely unprepared. Then something wonderful happened. He smiled. Not because he remembered to. Not because someone had teased him into it. He simply smiled. Of course. For the next hour, he patiently answered every question the 2 girls asked. Why were the chickens different colors? How did vegetables grow? Why was one tractor older than the other? I stood back and watched. He never rushed them. Never acted annoyed. Never once looked uncomfortable. Later, while the family explored the greenhouse, I quietly walked over. I thought you said you weren't good with people. He looked at the children laughing nearby. I guess. He smiled softly. I was wrong. By Sunday afternoon, the family was leaving. The father shook both our hands. This was exactly what we needed. His wife smiled. We haven't seen our girls this excited in months. The younger daughter hugged Scott without warning. Can we come back? Scott looked completely caught off guard. Then he laughed. I hope so. After their car disappeared down the road, the farm became quiet again. Scott stood in the driveway watching the dust settle. They liked it. They loved it. They really did. I looked at him. So did you. He nodded. I did. Business slowly grew. One booking became three. Three became weekends that were completely reserved. The greenhouse finally began producing enough specialty vegetables for local restaurants. The website brought visitors from neighboring towns. For the first time in years, the numbers in our financial records began moving in the right direction. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. Every month looked a little healthier than the last. One evening, Scott quietly placed a folded piece of paper beside my dinner plate. What's this? Open it. I unfolded it. The farm budget. One line had been highlighted. Owner salary. I looked up. You added yourself back. And you. I smiled. Finally. He nodded. I think. He looked almost shy. We've earned it. Autumn arrived before either of us noticed. The fields turned gold. The trees surrounding the property exploded into red and orange. People came simply to walk the trails and photograph the landscape. One Saturday evening, Bill joined us on the porch after everyone had gone home. He looked around the farm for a long time before speaking. Henry would have been proud. Scott looked down. I hope so. Bill shook his head. No. He pointed toward the fields. I know so. Then he looked at me. And you? What about me? You came here planning to sell. I did. What changed? I smiled toward the farmhouse. I found something I didn't know I was looking for. Bill grinned. I figured. A few weeks later, Scott and I walked the property after sunset. It had become our routine. No work, no planning, just walking. We eventually reached the hill where he'd first shown me the neglected fields months earlier. Everything looked different now. Rows of healthy crops, repaired fences, lights glowing warmly from the farmhouse. The place felt alive. I used to come up here alone. Scott said quietly. What did you think about? Mostly whether I'd failed. I stopped walking. You never failed. I believed I had. You kept this place alive long enough for someone else to help. He looked at me. I didn't do it alone. You did for 12 years. He smiled softly. I don't have to anymore. For a moment we simply stood there. The wind moved gently through the fields below. Finally, I turned toward him. You know. He waited. The best decision I almost made was selling this farm. Scott laughed. That's a terrible decision. It would have been. I'm glad you changed your mind. So am I. I reached for his hand. This time there was no hesitation. Scott intertwined his fingers with mine naturally, as though it had always belonged that way. I spent years thinking this farm was the thing I inherited. I said quietly, but it wasn't. He looked at me. No? I smiled. No. What was? You. His expression softened in a way I'd never forget. Slowly, he leaned forward and kissed me. Simple, gentle, nothing hurried. When we stepped apart, neither of us spoke immediately. The silence wasn't uncertain anymore. It was peaceful. The kind of silence that only exists when two people finally stop wondering where they belong. The following spring, we held a small community celebration to mark the farm's official reopening. Neighbors filled the yard. Children ran between the gardens. Music drifted across the fields. Bill stood near the entrance beside the wooden sign. He laughed when he noticed us watching. Never thought I'd see this place full again. Neither did we, Scott admitted. As the sun began setting, everyone gathered for one final photograph. Someone handed me the camera. No, Bill protested. You're in this one too. He waved another neighbor over to take the picture. Scott stood beside me. Our shoulders touched. The photographer smiled. Ready. I looked around one last time. The farmhouse, the barn, the greenhouse, the neighbors, the sign that read Walker and Evans Farm. Then I looked at Scott, the man I had once thought was a stranger. The man who had quietly spent 12 years refusing to abandon a place everyone else had given up on. The man who had unknowingly become the reason I finally understood what home actually meant. He smiled at me, not the careful smile from the day we met, not the hesitant one that appeared once a month. This one came easily, naturally, like it belonged there. I smiled back. The camera clicked. And for the first time in a very long time, neither the farm nor either of us was simply surviving. We were finally living.